C-171, Rat. Grandpa Koi almost gawked as he and Dirk froze in position, their spears having clashed perfectly to bring them both to a halt. Then, he burst out with a laugh. Bah! Yes, yes, yes. What a monster. Are you sure you aren't supposed to learn the spear? He stopped as he said so, looking at Dirk's form. That last thrust seemed to be the pinnacle of perfection. There were only some slight deviations, but that was actually caused by Dirk's constitution. As a spear king, Grandpa Koi knew that using a weapon would cause one's body to adjust to that weapon. Those adjustments were the final factor in achieving perfection, and it was why finding your perfect weapon early on was so important. If you only began to truly train with a weapon later on, the body would be more rigid and unchanging, becoming a limiter. On the contrary, a child was far more malleable and could easily adapt to become the perfect vessel for a weapon. Of course, nothing would stop true talent. It was why the Spear King was able to reach his level despite spending decades searching for the spear. He had already been well into adulthood, considered a talentless idiot who couldn't find his weapon, and yet, he was the one who rose above all those young geniuses. Now, as the Spear King looked at Dirk, he found the same talent that only the kings had. To come this far in only a few hours was impossible otherwise. Just his instincts placed him on that level. After all, to be able to so clearly sense your potential and the future of various different paths was an ability bordering on prophecy. It was the hidden requisite for becoming a king, and one that was impossibly unfair. After all, most people would simply begin to train techniques as early as possible, not knowing until much later that they had actually killed their potential back as mere children. They didn't even have the chance to try and reach that higher level. Dirk, while having been taught many techniques, never truly walked down any single path. While he preferred the sword, he never exclusively trained it. Since he first stepped foot into the academy as a kid, he always wielded several weapons ranging from axes to bows. That never changed even when he went to Azura's mountain where he learned to use knives, short swords, and other tools. All this time, Dirk felt that he didn't have a clear direction. He had simply proceeded with his anima resonance destruction technique, increasing his strength and physical abilities while honing control over his aura. As for his weapons, they were merely tools to transform his strength into lethal attacks. Now, he finally felt like he was becoming better. He finally felt that he was walking down the path he was truly destined for. That martial master told me something back then, words that I feel you will find immensely valuable, though they mean nothing to me who has reached the end of my road. Grandpa Koi retrieved his spear and spoke. I quote him directly. All martial masteries are connected. A spear technique can be executed no differently with a sword or a bow. This is illogical, yet the foundation for universal martial mastery. The further you travel down my path, the more illogical, profound, and fucking confusing the path gets. I mean, how do you use the bow as you would an axe? Yet, I swung my bow just like an axe and I was able to fell a branch of the world tree. All it cost me was the bow after it exploded. At least I was able to keep the string. Dirk's face gradually turned more confused as Grandpa Koi continued, his words shifting from philosophical to brutish. Seeing Dirk's weird face, he shrugged. I'm just quoting him directly. Oh, he said one more thing as well. He said, although it gets more confusing, that's what instincts are for. I trust my instincts so much that I blinded myself, yet I have better coordination than even some kings. Instincts are the best guide and only path for someone like me. The best part is how I can pick out a beauty from a mile away even though I can't see. And they seem to dig it when a blind guy compliments them. So yes, instincts are the way. They could tell me to jump off a mountaintop and I would do it. Same way I listen to my dick when it points me toward a brothel. Dirk barely stifled a chuckle. It seemed this guy was as horny as he was skilled. But those words seemed to glimpse some important wisdom. This man had instincts that even substituted for his vision. It was like he simply knew the things he needed to know about when he needed to know them. And he had absolute trust in those senses. And why wouldn't he? He could probably tell the future with them. Dirk didn't know if he was that good or talented, but he already knew that his path was the same as that martial master's, so he would walk it no differently. There was no other path for him, and for once, Dirk felt like he was willing to die on that hill. It wouldn't matter if Azura himself came back and forced him to learn one weapon. He would sooner drop dead than deviate. which meant that his approach to everything he did would change. There was no half-assing something this difficult, so Dirk would need to embody the very principles of that path. He wouldn't even take a piss if his instincts told him not to. Suddenly, Dirk turned toward Grandpa Koi, tilting his head. "I can't fight you yet, but I'll be back later." "Oh yeah? How long?" "Once I achieve basic martial mastery. I think 1 month will be enough." "What gives you that confidence?" "Well, I almost already have it." Dirk smiled. He had already trained with dozens of different weapons and knew tons of different martial styles that utilized every inch of his body. The only thing he needed to do was go through them all and perfect them. By itself, this wouldn't take a long time. But Dirk knew that he would soon be embroiled in whatever business they had at the otherworld. He wouldn't have the time to solely focus on it. Grandpa Koi smirked. "If you can do it, then don't let anything stop you. Thankfully, you're in a far better position than the Kimin Godsum." He wasn't a mage, and he had to pioneer his path. He also had nothing to rely on, no noble title to protect him, and surely no kings watching out for him. He was all alone, made a single wrong move, and perished. He was perhaps history's greatest martial genius, yet he wasn't able to reach the end of his potential. But you have things that he didn't. So perhaps, as long as you use that head of yours, you'll be able to get in just the right amount of trouble and grow until you reach the height that he couldn't. Dirk nodded. He saw no reason why he shouldn't surpass that man. In fact, if he couldn't despite his incomparable advantages, then he may as well give up and go into seclusion somewhere in a forest. Something like that would be much too shameful and an insult to everything he was given. "Well, let's continue." Grandpa Koi suddenly took up a stance, his eyes gleaming with interest. "I know plenty of martial styles myself, so even if you don't learn, I'll at least be your sparring partner." Then I'll thank you in advance. This will speed up my progress." Dirk also took a stance, getting low to the ground. Then, the two suddenly dashed toward each other, their figures exploding with power. Dirk dove in, his arms and legs delivering blows as he tried to grapple and corner Grandpa Koi. Meanwhile, Koi simply met him on equal terms. He drastically lowered his strength, purely utilizing his martial skill and vast experience. Unlike all of Dirk's enemies before, Grandpa Koi was able to keep up, read, and even counter Dirk's net of attacks. He wasn't overwhelmed by all the various styles of combat, keeping up with his speed just fine, and was able to avoid getting washed away in Dirk's rhythm. Back at the frontier base in the Horizon Empire, Dirk had almost toyed with Alec and his girlfriends. He was able to fight all three of them to a standstill, and would have won if he were trying to do anything other than just have a fun spar. They simply couldn't read him while he could read them like a book. He was able to counter all of their moves and tactics as if he had studied them for years, all while sweeping them into his own current of battle. They were children before a master. Now, the positions were swapped. Grandpa Koi was far too skilled, experienced, and powerful for any of Dirk's advantages to work. He was better in literally every way. And because he was also trying to help Dirk, he was the perfect sparring partner. At some point, Dirk even took out some weapons. He started with the axe, hacking down with overwhelming strength, moving slower yet with far more weight behind every movement. Despite the lower speed, Grandpa Koi didn't feel like Dirk was putting himself at a disadvantage. He felt like Dirk was still just as guarded as always. If anybody besides him were to try and dive in, taking advantage of his lesser speed, it would cost them dearly. They could only let him hack down at them, unable to even avoid his strikes. Of course, Dirk wasn't perfect. Grandpa Koi called upon his experience and used his attacks to point out many of Dirk's flaws. Whether it was footwork, the angles of his attacks, or the way he chained his strikes, he would find imperfections and make Dirk pay for it. In that way, Dirk was easily able to notice and correct himself. He wasn't overly punished because this wasn't a real battle. Everything was for the sake of Dirk's learning and growth. Like that, he shifted between more weapons. He worked with the bow, the sword, knives, a staff, and several things in between. Although there were countless weapons and variations, at some point, one weapon became no different from another. Their commonalities blended, and with enough experience, you would be able to merely look at a weapon and understand how to use it perfectly. Dirk didn't have this experience, but he did have tons of weapons and obscene combat instincts. Even Grandpa Koi became excited as he began to glimpse the extent of Dirk's ability. There was a reason he so confidently said that Dirk had the instincts of a king. Most people couldn't be evaluated as such. After all, just how many geniuses were there? And yet, how many ever became kings? 1 in a billion was a good estimate. Yet Grandpa Koi didn't hesitate to place him on that pedestal, and he only grew more confident of his appraisal the more he fought Dirk. Heh, what a damn monster. He smiled as Dirk jumped up a wall and spun around, aiming an arrow with his bow. When released, the around spun and shuttled straight for Koi's neck. If he were an ordinary person, this arrow would slice through their neck and sever the carotid artery. The shot was horribly accurate, even taking into account Koi's subsequent movement. In slow motion, it looked like Koi was going to deliver his neck to the arrow. But Koi was too good, so he simply stopped himself, the arrow flying past. By that time, though, another arrow was coming. This time, he watched as it aimed for the base of his neck, just between his collarbones. Another precise shot, but this time, he couldn't easily avoid it without deliberately dodging. However, this wasn't what concerned him. Instead, he was intrigued by the movement of anima. Around the arrow was a cyclone of air as it pierced through the atmosphere. However, along with that air was a cyclone of anima. To release anima into a weapon was hard enough, but to even detach it from yourself and load it into an arrow before firing it in a way that the arrow could utilize? Grandpa Koi only knew of a handful of bow techniques that could do such a thing, and they were all developed over dozens of years before becoming core secrets of martial families or empires. The bow was the hardest weapon to utilize anima with, after all. Yet, Dirk had actually done so by himself, and in such a short amount of time. It was like the anima within and around him simply followed his actions. He didn't even have to control it. As if it were a living entity, it went out of its way to empower everything he did. Of course, it wasn't actually anything so mystical. Instead, Dirk was unconsciously manipulating it with his instincts. He didn't have to think about it, but he was indeed controlling it. Still, the ability to do so should be far beyond him. Grandpa Koi couldn't stop himself from smiling. "My greatest student, we will continue until you drop." Saying that, Grandpa Koi sparred with Dirk with limitless stamina. Soon enough, several hours passed, and Dirk reached his limit both mentally and physically. At some point, every action of his was backed by anima and took more energy than normal. Several hours of this was enough to bring him to his knees, but he had gained invaluable experience. Dirk fell to the floor, his breathing labored and his skin boiling with heat. Grandpa Koi stood before him, not the slightest bit of moisture on his head and his mouth contorted in a gleeful grin. "Ah, how wonderful. I couldn't think of any better husband for my granddaughter. She's, not the only one. Oh, I shouldn't be surprised considering how extraordinary you are. Does she know?" "Yes." Dirk nodded through heavy breathing. He decided to spill this fact in order to extract some wisdom from this old man, or at least get his opinion on the matter. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, but Dirk didn't care. His instincts were leading the way now. Consequences be damned. Grandpa Koi rubbed his chin. "Well, I don't have an issue with it, but Pandora isn't one to lay down and take it. Still, since you both are together, it means she took it well. But she'll have to accept this girl. If she doesn't, then you may not have a choice. You would need to pick one at that point." Dirk was silent, but he understood that. Pandora said so herself. If Ava didn't meet a certain standard, then she wouldn't stand for it. And if Ava really were that weak, then he wasn't sure what he would do. He liked Ava, but the path he was walking would kill her if she were too weak. In that case, for both their sakes, he wouldn't be able to build a relationship with her. He desperately hoped that Ava was becoming as strong as she could, and as quickly as she could. But his hopes weren't very high. She was his age, and without a major advantage, how could she keep up with him and Pandora? They were both freaks who, even if not advancing incredibly fast, were developing their powers to unbelievable levels. Damn. Dirk cursed in his mind before shaking his head. Then, he laid down. He was too exhausted to care about anything else. "Oh, looks like Pandora is coming. I'll take my leave. Then again, she might just figure out I'm here. We'll see. Next time, come find me at the bar. We'll have a drink." Grandpa Koi smiled before disappearing. At the same time, Dirk passed out, and then Pandora walked in, looking at Dirk before narrowing her eyes and scanning around. We have a rat. C-172, dopamine. Dirk didn't know when, but he suddenly woke up. His mana vision was a little hazy before sharpening as his mind processed everything. The sights of his surroundings appeared. He was in the master bedroom of the Sky King. Pandora was also there, leaning against a wall while flipping through her book, not yet sensing his wakefulness. However, he wasn't concerned about her. Deep in his chest, a feeling that spurred from his soul, he could sense an entity beginning to come alive. Spite. Dirk realized what it was. Ever since his advancement, Spite had been deep in hibernation. It had been quite some time since then. Now she was waking, and Dirk could feel her presence quickly grow. Initiating boot procedures. Step 1. Wake up. Processing. Complete. Step 2. Insult my master. Huh. Dirk frowned as she continued. Generating insult. Insult me, and you won't be allowed to explore for a week. Archiving insult. Heh, good to have you back, Spite. Dirk smiled. He had actually been a bit worried that something had happened to her, but since he could still feel the existence of the stigmata, he could only wait. He was relieved she was okay. How are you feeling? Oh, is this concern and affection? Not going to tell me to simply give a briefing on all the changes. It seems you aren't remembering how thin my patience for bullshit runs. I'm doing very well. Thank you for asking, Chem. Dirk smirked inwardly before taking a deeper look at Spite. So, what's got your confidence soaring? Well, I've become better in every way thanks to your mana body. In the past, it was difficult to properly act as a tactical processor due to the lack of external sensors, and the nanites, while versatile, weren't as capable as they could have been. But all that's changed. I could quite literally operate your body like a puppet now. It's no exaggeration to say that I have control over every cell of your body. She explained simply, causing Dirk to realize that the changes to his body, while an amazing boost to his personal abilities, were amplified several times over with Spite's capabilities. Stand by. I'm going to run a deep scan. She suddenly said that as he thought. Then, Dirk felt his body shudder. It felt like he was going to freeze. He could feel Spite try to take control over his body, and should he let it happen, he would lose his autonomy. Of course, preventing it from happening proved to be under his complete jurisdiction. Spite couldn't do anything without his express permission, and she was a part of him anyway, so there was little need for that. Despite her antics, she never did anything he didn't want her to, especially when it mattered. So while the feeling was momentarily surprising, Dirk didn't hesitate to let go. Like that, he felt his entire body go limp and numb. He couldn't even sense his own limbs. His hearing disappeared, his sense of taste, touch, and smell going with it. Only the lack of eyesight was normal for him. So for a while, he was thrown into a world of true sensory deprivation. While he wasn't scared, he had to admit that the concept of being trapped in your own body, your mind floating in a world of darkness even while conscious, was a terrifying thing. He had heard stories of people going mad from such things, and for a moment, he felt like he understood. But then, he suddenly regained all his faculties. His fingers twitched as if nothing had even happened. Deep scan complete. Spite spoke and compiled the results. The skill active biokinesis is more than just greater healing and control over your body. Your cybernetics were integrated underneath it and enhanced. Now, your nanites are no longer a separate entity flowing through your body. They are now directly tied into your genetic code, allowing unprecedented control over the tiniest details of your constitution. Every cell in your body could be said to be paired with a corresponding nanite. This allows every part of your body to be tuned and manipulated. And I have the unique ability to tap into this biokinetic system directly, using my processing power to control everything acutely. To what end? I can cause cell proliferation, stop it, monitor the energy levels of every fiber of your body, tune your muscles like an engine, and enhance every organ function within that gut of yours. It would be better to ask what I couldn't do, and the answer to that is only the most extreme stuff. For example, I can't simply make your muscles grow several times bigger overnight, even though I can boost the effects of muscle growth. I also can't go beyond the confines of your genetic code, so growing a second heart is out of the question. How unfortunate. Dirk chuckled to himself. While a second heart did seem fun to have, he wasn't interested in playing with his genes. He might mutate into a monster if that happened. Other than that, My abilities as a tactical processor are now completely unlocked. They're even better than when you were a super soldier. I can directly assist in your physical combat, and with your mana body, I can mimic the functions of your missing auxiliary hardware. This was technically possible before, but greatly dampened in scope. Magic simply introduced too many obstacles and made some things obsolete. But now, I can operate at full capacity. Also, there have been some major changes to your stigmata. Suddenly, the tattoo on Dirk's back, that of a black cat, fluctuated before disappearing. Spite then appeared on his chest in her feline form. She looked the same as she did before. Black fur, golden eyes, and faint golden stripes on her back. Other than that, the only change Dirk noticed was how she looked a bit more ghostly, like some sort of spirit. At the same time as she appeared, Pandora noticed and turned. Dirk also rose from the bed, sitting up and crossing his legs. Dirk, good morning. Dirk spoke while stretching. As he loosened up, Spite sat down in front of him. Pandora looked at them and tilted her head. I had noticed that the cat hadn't been around much. Something happened? She went into hibernation. Right now she's telling me about her changes. Oh. Pandora nodded and went silent. Then, Spite's eyes glowed. Turns out, stigmas are not set in stone. First, the pistol form. Spite suddenly transformed with those words, appearing as a black pistol in Dirk's hand. He raised it, not noticing any changes. This pistol is capable of firing low-power spells with complexity capped at a single spell circle, generally useful as a magic tool, but not conducive to being a weapon that can fight above your power level. It's good enough for crowd control, but where you'll be going, you'll need something that packs a bit more of a punch. So, allow me to introduce your newest armament. Saying that, Dirk saw the pistol transform. It hovered before him, elongating into a much larger weapon and taking almost a minute to solidify into its new form. Then, it finished, landing in both of Dirk's hands. At first glance, he actually recognized it. It was a huge rifle almost as long as he was tall. On one end was a large platform where he was supposed to hold it. This rifle platform was decorated with hundreds of intricate circuits that flowed across its body. At the core of the circuits was a large cavity about the size of 3 fists, and from the cavity the circuits extended out to reach the barrels on the other side of the gun. In fact, an entire half of the gun was composed of these barrels. There were 6 barrels that floated in front of the platform in a hexagonal formation. This hexagon was about 10 inches wide, and the barrels were about 3 feet long, creating a massive firing chamber. The barrels weren't physically connected to the platform, but they still acted as a singular entity. Dirk could also sense the complex magic holding the entire thing together. The knowledge that went into its construction was far beyond him, but he also knew that Spite, a piece of his soul, was what comprised this weapon. So unless he learned about the soul, he wouldn't be able to understand its composition. Dirk admired the black weapon covered in gold circuits. At the same time, Spite explained, "This is the M6888 experimental arc cannon. Of course, this isn't an actual railgun that fires projectiles. It's simply modeled after it. But when forming magic, this model is actually a guide for how the magic is fired. Keep that in mind. I know quite a bit about this gun." Dirk smiled while stroking the floating barrels. He had used this weapon no small amount of times as a super soldier. It was basically a mobile tank with the punch it packed, but it was only ever placed in the hands of super soldiers. Back then, he had sunk entire warships with it. He had even downed enemy aircraft, both jets and high-altitude drones. With his equipment and the ability to control his body with impossibly precise cybernetics, he pulled off amazing feats of accuracy and destruction. Of course, that weapon didn't come out often. It was no different from a tactical missile that couldn't be defended against or stopped by countermeasures. The occasions that warranted its use were slim, and of those occasions, not all of them were acted upon. This left him very few chances to utilize that beautiful piece of engineering. But all of them were wonderful experiences that came flooding back when he held it in his hands. Of course, it wasn't exactly the same. This thing would fire magic, not projectiles. But the thought of being able to cast extreme magic with this thing capable of rivaling that cannon on Earth made him giddy. Of course, he'd have to develop the magic first, but that would also be fun. Pandora watched as Dirk stroked the weapon with a wide smile, his fingers scanning every corner of its construction. Her eyes couldn't help but widen at his weirdly affectionate actions. Wow, you handle that thing more than me. You're about to make me jealous of a piece of metal. Dirk hummed and looked over at her. He stared for a few seconds before willing the railgun away. Spite spawned as Dirk rose from the bed, crawling off it and walking over to Pandora, who leaned against the wall. He stopped in front of her, taking both her hands. She looked at him curiously as he did so. What's up with you? Oh, I also know about my grandfather. No need to hide it. I figured you would find out. He's helping me, which is the only reason I haven't done anything about it. How thoughtful. It seems you're always helping me out like this. I have very little to worry about with you here. I'm glad you recognize that. Hey, you seem a bit different. You don't usually give me compliments like this. I suddenly felt like doing so. Dirk smiled. Then, he looked down at their hands. Suddenly, he took both of her hands into one of his own. Then he raised them, bringing her arms over her head and placing them against the wall. Pandora's eyes widened in surprise. Oh my! She squealed a bit as Dirk suddenly went in and kissed her. It wasn't light either. After a moment, she could feel their tongues wind around each other. Everything was so sudden and intense that she lost herself in the feeling. Her eyes fluttering closed and her body feeling a bit weak. That feeling was further amplified as she felt him press his body against hers. Not only that, but a shiver went down her spine when his knee rose between her legs, as if to prop her weak body up and tease her all at the same time. The final straw was when his free arm slid around her back, his hand rising up to her skull where he lightly pulled on some of her hair. Although he used that to angle her head better, it simultaneously acted to melt her completely. Despite his every action being gentle, she felt completely subdued. Her overactive mind almost couldn't keep up with it. It felt like every sensation was completely new, and she didn't understand why she had turned to putty so easily. Well, she faintly understood why. It was the understanding that, although he was gentle, his obscene strength could utterly dominate her at any given moment, and the anticipation that he would spur something deep within her that she didn't even know was there. Then, after several minutes, and when she was about to go entirely limp, Dirk pulled away. He slowly separated from her as she slid to the floor. Her breathing was labored and her eyes were misty and a bit vacant. Dirk smiled as he adjusted himself. My goodness, you make this so difficult for me. I can't believe I have to hold back for the foreseeable future. Pandora was silent as he walked out of the room. Inwardly, though, she wasn't sure if she was too baffled to even think straight, or if she was utterly enraged by his audacity to say something like that. Hold himself back? Was she not the one being blue-balled? If she didn't mysteriously feel like she couldn't walk, she would have cast some grand magic to teach him a lesson. She almost didn't believe that he was actually Dirk. But after thinking for a moment, she suddenly grinned wide. Pressing their bodies against each other had left nothing to the imagination, and Dirk, who she had known to be as stoic as a monk, had suddenly become a bit more expressive. She surely wasn't imagining the steel beam in his pants. To think that he had actually gotten horny, and for her. Or was it the new gun? No, it was definitely her. Pandora felt like she had achieved a victory. So with those thoughts, she took some time to enjoy all the dopamine in her brain. C-173, hired. Dirk left Pandora behind, and as he left, Spite jumped onto his shoulder with a most curious glint in her eye. What the hell was that? Oh right, you weren't conscious for that conversation. Dirk smiled before digging through his memories and visualizing the conversation he had with Grandpa Koi. Spite received the data and quickly understood the contents of the conversation. This gave her a realization. I see. I plan to live that way from now on. I'd say I'm adapting well since I was able to easily step beyond my comfort zone and do that to Pandora, something I definitely wouldn't do before. But why did your instincts tell you to do that? Don't know. I was just thankful for her consideration. She's also pretty, so I felt like it. Wow, I never thought I'd see this day. You're officially a normal horny teenager. Her words made him smirk. Not long after, Dirk arrived in the command center. There, he found a lot of people he didn't know, some of them doing actual work while others were just socializing. Everyone glanced at him once when he entered before going back to their business. What caught Dirk off guard, though, was how in sync everyone was when glancing at him. There was an instant and total silence upon arrival, and he could feel both eyes and magic falling upon him for a brief moment. It was clear that every single one of these people were trained. Dirk could sense varying depths of ability, but in general, they were all extraordinarily sharp. Of course, after that momentary glance, everything went back to normal, everyone acting like he wasn't even there. Surely they would all know who he was, though. Thinking that, Dirk looked around before noticing that Exos wasn't there. "Hey, where's Exos?" Dirk asked a random man nearby, not particularly caring about his identity. The man faced him before nodding. "Greetings. Exos has moved into his own room and workshop. He's on the second deck near the west wing, just past the material storage facility." "I see. Thank you." "Of course." The man politely said goodbye before Dirk left in the general directions he was given. After Dirk left the room, the man looked back toward the friend he was initially speaking to. He had a weird smile on his face. The friend asked, "What is it?" "Nothing. I just think some people need to learn better manners. Calling me like I'm some sort of servant. What an arrogant boy." The man smirked, but the friend actually frowned, making him confused. "What's wrong with you? You don't know who that is, do you?" The friend muttered. But before the man could question it, they turned around to see Dirk walking back in. His face was neutral, and he walked over to the man calmly. The man turned to face him, not sensing anything out of the ordinary. But then, he watched as Dirk disappeared as if he'd never been there. That moment, he felt his body weaken as his mind screamed in panic. But he couldn't move or react. Then, only a second later, that panic disappeared, leaving behind confusion and anxiousness as Dirk reappeared in front of him. When that happened, he saw his hair fell from his head and felt a cool air grace his now bald scalp. Everyone in the room froze just like he did, all eyes falling on Dirk, who had shaved a man's head in but a fraction of a second. Dirk let out a small huff as he remembered the area he was sent to. It was an animal storage room that held a dozen or so large beasts, for what he didn't know, but it carried an amazingly heavy stench considering it had just been moved into. The stench of that room hit me rather hard. I admit, it was a funny joke. "Now, would you kindly give me directions to Exo's actual room? I have business with him." "I will." Someone else spoke up as the man remained mute. After that, Dirk got the actual directions, and with a smile he left, no longer returning. Once the room calmed down, the friend hit his now bald colleague. "Dumbass. Shit, nobody told me. Just don't be an asshole next time. You're lucky you didn't get scalped. He shaved your head almost perfectly." The friend admired Dirk's work for a moment, causing the man to retreat in embarrassment. Meanwhile, Dirk arrived at the east wing where a large workshop was located. This was where Exos set himself up, and upon walking in, Dirk could tell how at home the dwarf made himself. Couches, tables covered in papers, dozens of gadgets on both the floor and ceiling, plus a large cooler full of food and drinks. Exos sat behind a desk, operating a massive holographic screen that displayed hundreds of symbols and lines of runic code that Dirk couldn't even begin to understand. "Ah, Dirk." Exos jumped up from the desk when Dirk appeared in front of him, surprised and happy to see him. "I'm glad you're here. I have something to ask of you." "Oh, okay. Go ahead." Dirk ran with it, motioning for Exos to continue. He nodded and spoke. "You see, I'm good at enchanting and designing software, as Pandora would call it. But I can't forge the hardware for all this gear. Since I can no longer employ the help of various dwarven forge masters at the Haven, I was hoping to receive yours after hearing Pandora's praises of your work. Of course, I don't intend to make you work for free. In fact, I already have several ideas about various weapons and gear I could make you in exchange for your services." Exos laid out his proposition, and for a moment it made Dirk smile. Weapons and armor, especially good ones, were almost always enchanted. Enchantments could turn a lifeless piece of steel into a conduit for devastation, or turn a basic sheet of leather into a tome of endless magic knowledge. The field of enchanting was limitless, especially for someone like Exos. The best enchanters were even considered gods of creation. To them, enchanting was no different from rewriting the world in their image. Of course, software couldn't go without hardware. Forge masters were equally important, even if their general standing was diminished since more people could forge than enchant. However, forge masters would never be able to give the life of their creations any intelligence. Case in point, Dirk's armor. He had spent a long time making that scale armor, only for it to simply be just that. While the armor was imbued heavily with the elements, that power wasn't given any direction. It would take someone like Exos to enchant it and give it some utility. Dirk knew about several enchantments that would be good to have, like response enchantments, active ability enchantments, passive boosts, and more. And currently, Exos was the best enchanter he knew. Coming from a world of cybernetics and complex software, he was more than okay with receiving Exos' convoluted enchantments so long as they did the job. And he would no doubt get stronger in the future. So building this symbiotic relationship where he forged the hardware and Exos wrote the software would be endlessly beneficial. So Dirk easily agreed. Sure, I can help you. I enjoy forging and have nothing to work on, so I'd be happy. Great. I look forward to our cooperation. Exos clapped in glee before shaking Dirk's hand. Then, he got down to business. Pandora said we have about a week before arriving at our first stop. I'd like to work with you until then in order to get familiar with your capabilities. Right now, my processors have several limitations with the hardware. I put it together with a bunch of scraps and using my metal magic, but that leaves much to be desired. Are you capable of metal manipulation? I am. Good. It will be needed. Now, I have several schematics drawn up. I'd like to see if you can make pieces of them. The best case scenario would be for most of the gear to be singular constructions, but we'll need to build our way up to that. Over there is your forging equipment. Pandora says you're familiar with it and decided to set everything up here. Dirk nodded and looked over. Beside Exo's workshop was a forge room, and inside it was everything that had been inside Pandora's forge vault that she had given him. Not only that, but there were several other facilities and tools, some of which Dirk had only ever seen in a high-class forge room like what Tabaston had at the academy. It was fully equipped to make anything he could dream of, and Exos was similarly given all the tools he could ever ask for to enchant. Since their rooms were side by side, it was clear that they would be working together. Perhaps Pandora planned for that a while ago. There was a gate between the forge room and Exos' workshop, which the two walked through. Exos took with him several sheets of paper and laid them out on a steel table by the anvil. After that, he started explaining all of the different parts and his requirements. These were little pieces that he had designed explicitly to gauge Dirk's abilities as a forge master. So some were large, some were really small and intricate, and all of them were made of different elemental metals. Infernia, the fire metal; aerolite, the air metal; geode, the earth metal; prismatica, the water metal. There was even some void metal and hallowed steel, the dark and light metals. They all had different attributes. Some were denser than others, some more malleable, and they all reacted differently to different forging methods. Dirk had only learned how to handle the 4 basic elemental metals, not void metal or hallowed steel. So the schematics Exos drew for those 2 special elemental metals would be a challenge. However, that's where Dirk's doubts stopped. Many of Exos' test pieces were complex, and if there was anything Dirk was confident with, it was handling things with precision. That was especially so now that he had perfect control over his body. With spite and his active biokinesis, every hammer strike and every minute bend of the metal would be infallible. Even before his advancement, he would be confident, let alone now. So Dirk decided to show off a little. Exos wasn't one to waste time, so the two got straight into business. Dirk wielded a hammer and received a schematic. It was a cubical frame made of geode. The frame had 6 different interlocking pieces. The joints of these pieces had complex joint mechanisms with very little room for error. On Earth, something like this would be made with a plasma or laser cutter. Taking the schematic, Dirk had analyzed the entire thing before storing it and overlaying it in his vision. Then, he grabbed a geode ingot and got to work. Obsidius appeared with his call, slithering over his hands to form the living gloves. After that, he went to the furnace to heat up the ingot with the living flame. When it was hot enough, he was able to split the ingot into 6 pieces. Then, he left 5 pieces to stew in the furnace while he took the 6th to work on. At the anvil, he equipped an earth element hammer and started pounding away. The metal formed underneath his precise strikes, taking on the general shape of one piece of the frame. The metal hadn't even cooled before Dirk was done getting the general shape. Then he started using a chisel to make the cuts. The frame was generally flat besides the ends where the joints would be, and all the ends had 3 distinct cuts where they would interlock with 2 other pieces, making a 3-way joint. Dirk used the sharp chisel to make the general cuts. In fact, he used several different types of chisels, from flat ones to pointed ones that looked like needles. It was only when he had the shapes of the joint locks that he put down the chisels and pulled out another tool. With blades and other large items, forge masters could use their hands to smooth out metal or morph it to perfection. But there were some things that couldn't be done with the sausage fingers of a forge master, and that's where this special tool came into play. It was technically a type of chisel, but due to its use it was in a league of its own. Chisels were numbered based on their length and width, name things like a 2 chisel or a 5 chisel. But this chisel was known as a 0 chisel. It was formally called the 0 edge and informally called the 0. They were expensive and only found in the workshops of the most skilled forge masters. To the naked eye, it looked no different from a needle, but that needle point actually had the slightest flat length to its edge. That indiscernible edge gave it the utility a needle point lacked, and it was used only to make tiny corrections. After all, a significant portion of all high-level crafts that a forge master would make also had to be prepared for enchanting, and there were many crafts that required an extreme level of precision, especially as they became more complex and powerful. Dirk had only used a 0 edge a few times with Tobastin, and those few times only taught him about the rules when using the tool. He didn't learn any techniques or situational knowledge with it, but he still found use for it. So while it took a while, he was actually able to use the 0 in order to complete the shape for one of the cubical pieces. He didn't temper it or finalize the product, but that was unnecessary for the task at hand. This was basically carpentry with metal. He just needed to get the shape down. And unknown to him, Exos had confirmed Dirk's ability almost immediately. Just seeing the way he moved his body with unparalleled accuracy made him excited, which only grew the more he watched. Exos didn't move his eyes away once through the process of Dirk's work. He was enraptured, wondering how a human could display dexterity that would make a dwarf jealous. Of course, he also noticed the lack of proper technique. In fact, Dirk did things in a brutish and direct manner, leaving little room for finesse. But the results were undeniable, and in fact, Exos liked it. He had learned a lot about forging because he had to ensure the production quality of his requests, and he knew that some forge masters were outright incapable of producing some of his works simply because their technique was incompatible with his work. But Dirk went around all difficulties, simply doing what worked. Although he had no technique and what seemed like rudimentary knowledge, his ability to piece his way toward the final vision was amazing. So when Dirk finished the first piece and presented it, Exos couldn't help but blurt out, "You're hired." C-174, entrance. Dirk was surprised as Exos so directly decided to give him passing marks. He had made several pieces to test Dirk's skill, but after just one he seemed satisfied. In fact, what he made wasn't even the entire test piece for Geode, just one of 6 parts. Dirk's brow raised as he glanced back toward the dwarf. "Are you sure?" "I am. Your skill is more than enough. In fact, I've met forge masters at the Haven who have created Tier 6 crafts that have lesser skill than you." "Really? That seems unlikely." "Please, you overestimate how shameless dwarves can be. There are many who simply brute force the power of their craft up to a high level by simply stuffing it with overloaded mana. So while it would technically be a grade 6 craft, in terms of skill it wouldn't even match up to a decent grade 5. But I have a good eye for skill, and I can tell that you're easily at a grade 6 standard. And that's without a proper technique. Your basics seem to be perfect though, making up for that fact." Exos dulled out praise, making Dirk smile. He had never really gotten any compliments for his work outside of Tobastin, who trained him. The only other thing that had made a big impression was his armor, but that never came out often since it was a part of Obsidius. Exos continued, "You seem especially good at precise alterations, which will be crucial for the things I have in mind. Stuffing more power into a singular processor is demanding that I go smaller, so I need hardware that can follow." "I'll expect that kind of work then." "Yes. My new codified enchanting methods are evolving so fast that I can barely keep up with the ever-expanding possibilities. There's simply too much to discover and study." When I build one thing utilizing my best knowledge, I find that my limits have already been exceeded by the time it is finished, leading to a cycle of constant upgrades and scrapping for something better. But it's all so exciting that I can barely stop to eat. Exos scratched his head, and upon further observation, Dirk did indeed notice that Exos looked far more gaunt than he did in the past. He might conclude that Exos had been under a lot of pressure, but the reality was quite the opposite. He was simply so engrossed in his work that he forsook his health for more time to experiment. It was only unfortunate that he wasn't a body refiner, otherwise he would have much more fuel to work. Dirk couldn't imagine what he could do if that were the case. Suddenly, Exos shook his head. But enough about that. Since I've decided that your skills are my saving grace, we can get straight into the real work. Come take a look at my latest designs. If possible, I would like to begin work soon. There are several systems on the Sky King that need my input in order to prevent future maintenance issues. Not only that, but Pandora has tasked me with what is essentially weaponizing my processors. They'll help us during our time in enemy territory. With those words, Exos dragged Dirk off into a world of complex engineering. The designs he had in mind were a dozen times more complex than the test piece he had Dirk make. It was clear that precision was the main issue, and these processors did indeed demand high levels of miniaturization. If Exos was heading down the path that Earth did, then this would only get worse. Dirk realized that even if his skills could keep up, he simply wouldn't have the tools necessary to create what Exos would want him to in the future. At some point, things just became too small for humans to interact with. Shockingly, though, Exos already knew this and designed a special set of forging tools that they would need to build and use for the processors. He also started designing housing units that could circumvent the miniaturization issues. Those housing units would have to be built by Dirk, but they would be universal in that Exos could enchant the processor inside however he wished without needing to adapt the hardware. Of course, universal processing units were a bit beyond him at the moment, but the fact that he had thought of all these issues and begun preparing for it left Dirk in awe. Dirk was able to keep up, at least conceptually, with everything Exos showed him, and the process of going through everything took around 3 hours, after which Dirk became increasingly bored as Exos talked about more of the engineering instead of anything he could follow. Eventually, he managed to slip away. Still, he had to promise to be back the next day. Exos was even more eager than him to begin their projects. Not that Dirk complained. Exos had already proven to be an extremely valuable asset to their team. That value would only grow with time and opportunity, further unleashed by Dirk's support. And Dirk would be able to receive the fruits of Exos' labor in multiple ways. They had already talked about crafting armor, and many of the enchantments Exos spoke of made Dirk excited. There was much to anticipate, but crafting was only one of Dirk's focuses. Since they had a week, Dirk intended to squeeze out as much power as he could during that time. His main order of business, besides his martial arts, was developing spells for his new stigma. Spite now had 4 forms: a tattoo, a cat, a pistol, and now a railgun. The railgun was capable of great devastation, that much was certain, but Dirk needed to develop spells that made best use of its abilities. Unlike the pistol, the railgun wasn't limited in its conductivity. Where the pistol could only fire a single circle spell, the railgun could handle any number of spell circles. This meant there was no limit in complexity and, by extension, no limit in the power of each shot. Unfortunately, Dirk didn't know much about large-scale spells, but fortunately, he knew someone who did. In fact, that was all she seemed to ever cast. Pandora rarely used magic, and that was because she rarely entered battle. Dirk had only seen her cast a few offensive spells, and 2 of them were massively powerful. The first was the Blood Ice Needle that killed the Turtle General at the ruined city. The second was the huge fogging spell she cast when trying to steal the key artifact of Earth. That fogging spell had been more than a visible obstruction. It had been a magic obstruction that hampered mana senses and stifled hostile spells, and it covered the entire battlefield, something that couldn't be done casually. Of all the times she cast spells, Dirk saw little in the way of personal spells. His mother, on the other hand, had amazing personal spells. It was why she was able to help him develop pistol spells. Now, Dirk sought Pandora's help for the large spells. Of course, she was more than happy to help, especially after the gift he gave her. She seemed to be in a constant good mood after that, so she didn't hesitate to spill her knowledge. The earth element was their only overlapping attribute, so that's where she was able to provide the most help. Plus, she knew exactly how the railgun should be used, so their directions were identical. At first, they started with the basics. The complexity of a spell was dictated by how many spell circles comprised it. While a single spell circle could have varying levels of depth, it was generally restrictive and limited in output. That was because a single spell circle could only contain so much runic information. Adding more mana was the most direct way of adding more information. Adding more directions to the spell, such as forming fire into a fire lance or forming metal into an arrow, required more instructions. Because of this, you had to balance a spell's complexity with its power output. That is, until you added more circles. Adding another circle could multiply the maximum level of runic information allowed. This meant more power and more instructions. Not only that, but special configurations of spell circles could increase the size limit by magnitudes. Of course, it took great knowledge to utilize these kinds of spells. The biggest spells Dirk had ever seen came from the key artifact during its battle with Umangit, where it created a 21-circle spell. Back then, to defend against that spell, Umangit had only utilized a 16-circle spell. With each spell circle came an exponential amount of information to process. It wasn't as simple as stuffing more power into it. More information begets more information, no matter the form. So the amount of spell circles couldn't increase without limit. Because of that, there was an efficiency issue. But that was specific to every spell, so such things could only be worried about after developing a working spell. All these things meant that large spells couldn't be easily created. For normal mages, creating a 10-circle spell could take months if not years. Anything more complex couldn't be created at all unless you stood at the peaks of power. There was a reason that age was almost synonymous with greater power. For a mage, accumulation was extremely important. More knowledge almost always directly resulted in more power. Of course, Dirk and Pandora didn't have that time, nor did they seem to care about the complexities of making a spell. After a day of working together, they had already created a rudimentary 7-circle spell. It was rather simple, a metal spell that launched a projectile at supersonic speeds. This projectile was much more massive than a bullet, resulting in an obscene amount of kinetic energy being put behind it. As for the targeting solutions, they would be left entirely up to Dirk. The spell only had to fire it forward, but of course, doing such a thing wasn't so simple. There were many factors that could deviate a projectile's trajectory, even with magic. Simple mana turbulence could brush it a mere millimeter in another direction and cause a missed shot. For this, they had to make many adjustments. Those things came during their next day of work. And with those adjustments came more issues. Like in programming, any small edit could create an entire list of bugs. Spells seem to be annoyingly brittle creations, but with enough trial and error, those things could be ironed out, unlike programming bugs. Those were eternal. Like that, by the third day, they had created the first railgun spell. Nothing more than a spell that launched a metal projectile, but it carried more power than any of Dirk's magical attacks thus far. Just a single shot of this 7-circle spell would consume a whopping 60% of his mana. Not only that, but under normal circumstances, it would take around 8 seconds to build this spell and fire it. However, with Spite's ability to store perfect spell constructions, not unlike Pandora's Book of Life, that time was cut down to nothing. But this wasn't so much due to Spite as it was Dirk's mana body. This trait allowed him to move his mana with perfect precision and control, and by extension, Spite could do the same thing. This meant that it wouldn't take him time to stream mana out of his body and into the stigma. It was like he could simply will the mana into the railgun, and it would form the spell like water filling a cup. This seamless spellcasting made using the railgun almost too easy. It was no wonder a mana body was required to rise to the highest levels of power. Without it, it would be impossible to cast large circle spells even if you knew how. With the creation of that spell, Dirk could now utilize his greatest magical weapon. Of course, the kinds of spells he could create were endless with the railgun. It would simply take time to make them. Along with his creativity, Pandora could only help him with so much, and he would have to make spells utilizing his other elements independently. And he spent time doing this for the rest of their trip. Of course, he only had so many hours to do so. Grandpa Koi wanted his attention on martial arts, while Exos wanted his attention on forging. Not only that, but Dirk had yet to start the next steps of his mana cultivation or body refining. That would take some study, but it seemed he was being pulled in all directions as even Pandora wanted his attention for both magic and intimate affairs. Dirk did what he could, but in the end, he felt drained. Thankfully, that's when they made it to their first stop. On the last day, the Sky King slowed as it rested in the sky. It overlooked a particularly special landscape, an iconic one to the few who frequented this area, the entrance to the otherworld.